Welcome back to Deepin State, presented by Gold Hawks. I am your host, Nick Hawks. On today's episode, we have Lex Sokolin, managing partner and co-founder over at Generative Ventures. This episode is sponsored by Gold Hawks and Associates, the most experienced DePIN consultancy in the space. We help projects develop strategy, messaging, and token incentives. We'll have a little bit more on us later in the show. Before we get started, make sure you smash the like, subscribe, the bell, all those things that helps us bring great guests like Lex to you. Lex, thanks for coming on today. I know you're busy.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
I'm psyched. So we got to share the stage at the Maison event in Denver, but for folks who don't know what you do, can you give me a brief kind of overview of what you do, at least as it relates to Deepin space?
Absolutely. So I'm a co-founder of a venture fund called Generative Ventures. We do early stage seed and Series A investing, and our focus is on Deepin and Web3 AI. And so we have a strong thesis around the machine economy being decentralized and the machine labor from AI coming onto the decentralized infrastructure of Deepin. So we spent a lot of time looking at that stack. Today is a fun day to record because we just had our announcement that Peaq, our kind of marquee investment in the Deepin space, raised their $15 million round. So really excited for that to hit the news.
Yeah, super psyched to see those guys grow. I mean, we're seeing these things grow across the space. So Peaq, Solana, whatever, all the different L1s, L2s out there. Neat to see that. And then you just talked to, was it 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽 𝐃𝐞𝐏 over at NVIDIA's financial services? And he said something that apparently blew your mind, how they've sped up compute power by 1,000,000x over the last decade and how that compares to kind of normal investments. You want to talk a little bit about that and how it might apply to Deepin?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a background in I was at Consensus for a while, for 4 years, doing crypto economics and token engineering, and then DeFi and fintech before, and then I had a fintech company. So one of the things I do is I try to connect all the different threads of my career and drag along all of these ideas, whether they are, how neobanks and robo-advisors work, to how DeFi is changing the financial rails, to how AI is bringing the economy to decentralized infrastructure. And so I was talking to the guy who runs NVIDIA's financial services division, trying to get out of him like all the ways that AI is supposed to transform financial services. And I couldn't do it. No matter what I asked him, I just couldn't do it. The only thing he wanted to talk about was like GPU acceleration of the cloud. And it's pretty impressive. I mean, they're now in the business of creating these gigantic supercomputer clusters. I know BNY Mellon just rented one from NVIDIA recently. So even though in our space, I feel like it's the stories about the chips and the models and so on, like NVIDIA's story to itself is being this gigantic cloud infrastructure that's able to use their advanced cards to speed up the tasks for data processing, classification, all the stuff that big companies do. So I thought that was it was a different direction than I was expecting him to talk about.
Yeah. That's how these things go sometimes. Let's see. I guess that maybe we zoom out then and talk a little bit about how you see the volume of data and the amount of compute affecting projects building in the kind of blockchain and machine economy space. As these things expand, like what do you see? Like, oh, this is an unlock that happens that maybe we didn't see before or a year or two ago.
Yeah, I think it's been really great to have Deepin as a label come up in much more popular crypto culture. I think it's been helpful to take things that were disparate but nonetheless early and clump them together into a theme. And what I'm hoping is that as a result, we're going to go from this era where the most important thing has been to bootstrap supply, and I think a lot of what crypto does for IoT is create the decentralized network of the stuff, whether the stuff is the GPUs or the cars or the phones or the GPS, whatever it is. And that's kind of that first part of the S curve, the S adoption curve, where it's really hard to do that with a traditional company where you have a huge fixed capital outlay, whereas in Deepin, you can use tokens to do that. And I think we've had lots of evidence of coin networks getting to a place where they have lots of supply. So the next phase, or like unlock, or the thing that we all need to do, is figuring out the demand side. How do you bring customers over? And that's where I think we're now at the stage where it's not just like independent projects that are trying to go into the wind and become popular, but rather you have these ecosystems that can build on each other. And so one of the inside of Web3, so Web3 native demand for that supply that's been built up in the same way that, for example, Filecoins powered the NFT boom. I think that the decentralized GPU and compute stuff is going to be underneath a lot of Web3 AI. So I see Web3 AI powering from the demand side a bunch of the networks that are now available for as infrastructure.
Okay. And then in that, like, what are the new forms of internet kind of experience that you think we'll see at the intersection of Web3 services, DePIN, and AI? How does that play out?
That's a really hard question. I think the frame that I have is labor. And this is a slightly different frame than kind of like applications, right? So people talk about, are you building infrastructure? Are you building applications? And I think there's a whole kind of conversation. You can try to zero in on what are the applications, and you can talk about social and Farcaster taking off on base, or you can talk about gaming, and is this the gaming cycle finally, and so on. To me, that's fine. That's all great. That's reasons why people would come and interact with stuff. But for me, the key missing piece from Web3 is the ability to put labor in and create GDP and create an economy. And then that economy ends up being banked by DeFi and by all of the financial infrastructure we've put in. So today we have a lot of financial infrastructure, but very little productivity. And so in a somewhat hand-wavy, abstract way, like I'm looking at generative AI and I'm saying, this thing makes digital objects, whether they are content or whether it's images or videos or whatever, or software code, right? I think projects like Devin, for example, show that you can write software code pretty autonomously. And so if you've got machine labor and the sort of the gears that turn all the inference and the things that intermediate like the inference to happen. So you've got model marketplaces and you've got tokens, and then inference competes for those tokens and so on. So the gears for the inference to happen are powered by crypto economics and are sitting on decentralized models. Those models are using decentralized GPUs to actually do the work. And then, then you get to the capability to do the work and bring labor into Web3 in a digitally native way. And, that's kind of a precedent to your question of like, well, what's the thing actually going to be? And I don't know. I think we are going to explore that as an industry probably for the next 3 to 4 years of like, once you have the ability to have these, I hate the word primitives, but like these basic labor primitives of actually creating stuff, but doing it not just through human contribution, but through software contribution, that's going to add up to lots of autonomous agents running around and doing tasks and functions and fulfilling objectives. But the churning underneath and the ownership structure should be like a Web3 native version. Got it.
And I think you've said this kind of speaks to, there's a recent article that you wrote where you said traditional economies allocate about 10 to 20% of GDP to financial sectors. Web3 shouldn't be any different. I mean, I know right now Web3 is significantly different. And so maybe this is what you're seeing is kind of the shift back from whatever 80 to 100% of just crazy speculative bullshit to an actual like a sustainable long-term piece. Maybe the last thing we talk about is this idea of, as we integrate AI, is one thing that we've all seen, interacting with ChatGPT, is they don't always get it right, and they do this hallucination piece. Are you looking at companies doing kind of verified AI responses? I know you've talked about ZK Perusin and the computation process. So, like, what are you looking at there?
Yeah, so I think to the first point around financial revenue. So I think it was a fair assumption or thesis coming into this crypto thing, saying like, this is the new financial industry. And I think we've processed that for quite a bit. And it's not enough for two reasons. One is
Right.
the traditional finance industry is not going to let us have it, and there's no nice way to win it, right? So
Right.
they're happy to repackage crypto native products and sell them, but they're not going to rip out their core banking systems or portfolio management systems or payment rails and say, we're going to run on crypto now. That's the last thing they'll do. They will do it, but it'll be the last thing. And so it is a better financial infrastructure, but finance comes after you have economic activity. It doesn't come before, so you need something that actually is organic and on chain. And so to the second question about kind of the AI's hallucinating, I think it's wonderful that this is now in the popular culture, this idea that like this machine mind is hallucinating some outcome, because it's, if you go deeper, like we're all hallucinating everything that we experience in the world, right? All the sensory inputs that we take and then render for ourselves and so on. Like our entire life is a self-hallucination. So I think there's actually, to me, it makes the AIs a lot more human to see them making these errors or like being unable to do math in the way that like a second grader struggles with math.
Yeah.
But I think outside of like the actual decision making that they create or the actual answers they give, there's a more profound thing when you bring this stuff on chain. And it's the question is the thing you brought on chain the answer from the model, or is it some guy with a spreadsheet?
Right.
It's the same thing as it's a much more complex version of the Oracle problem, which is like, is the data coming in garbage or is it the real world data? And how do we validate that? How do we make that anti-fragile? And so, yeah, we're definitely interested in a lot of the stuff around ZKML, as well as other methods. There's other methods to make AI trustless and bring it on chain. So, we've talked with the ZKL team, Inference Labs, 𝐒𝐻𝐬𝐲𝐬 is a really interesting project. And I think one of the jobs of crypto will be truth and figuring out how to bring how to bring truth to that machine output and pull away the human influence, because the incentives to corrupt the stuff will be, of course, very high.
As always, yeah. There's always like these big incentives to, when there's huge value, to capture as much value as you can. So, ripping. Lex, thanks a ton for coming on. I know you are super busy and you've had a ton of talks today. Where can people find you to learn more, follow you, see what's going on with you?
Thanks so much for having me. You can find me on Twitter at Lex Sokolin, and check out genventures.xyz for the fund. And then if you're interested in a newsletter right away, check out the FinTech Blueprint.
Right on. I'll drop links to those down in the description. Thanks a ton for coming on.
My pleasure.